welcome to 37th in the World, the official podcast of the Georgetown Journal of International Affairs. I'm your host, Joanne Chen. In today's episode, we're examining the recent U.S. military strikes on vessels and what these actions mean for Latin America, especially in the context of U.S. relations with Venezuela and regional anti-drug operations. To help us unpack this, we're joined by Dr. Ryan Berg, Director of the Americas Program and Head of the Future of Venezuela Initiative at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Dr. Berg, thank you so much for being here today. And to begin, could you provide our listeners with some context about the recent U.S. military strikes on vessels in the Caribbean Sea and Pacific Ocean?
Thank you so much, Joanne, and it's a pleasure to be on the podcast with you and all of your listeners. As a proud Hoya, it's great to be able to talk to all the Hoya listeners that are out there. So Hoya Saksa. On September 2nd, this campaign began with a spectacular video that was published by the Secretary of State showing what we think was a drone attack on a suspected narco-laden vessel off the coast of Venezuela. Since then, we've seen this paradigm of dealing with drug trafficking expanded, not just to that one area, but to much of the Southern Caribbean, and now to the Pacific with some of the latest strikes. In total, as we sit here right now recording this podcast in early November, there have been about 17 strikes conducted against vessels throughout the Southern Caribbean, but also now into the Pacific. And so the United States is conducting most of these strikes with military assets that are in Puerto Rico and are using Puerto Rico as their main station for maintenance, for logistics and resupply. And now that the theater has expanded to the Pacific, where there is the vast majority of the cocaine trafficking, especially, that reaches the United States, the U.S. government is using its access to a base in El Salvador called Comalapa, which is allowing the United States to patrol, surveil, and exercise strikes against a much wider swath of the Pacific than it would have been able to reach before with just access to bases in Puerto Rico. So I would argue, Joanne, that what we're seeing is a paradigm shift here on how the United States deals with counter-narcotics. This is not just a Southern Caribbean thing anymore. It's not just a Pacific thing. It's an entire Western Hemisphere theater-wide thing now, where the administration is sending the message that foreign terrorist organization designations for cartels in Latin America and the Caribbean brings consequences. It is these are lethal consequences in this case, and that the old model of doing things with the U.S. Coast Guard is likely over and not going to be seen again. And the new model, which features the U.S. Navy and the U.S. Air Force, much more likely to be the operative model going forward for dealing with drug trafficking in the Western Hemisphere.
Yes, thank you for laying out that background. And so moving on from Washington's goals to the regional effects, how do we see the U.S. strikes affecting states in Latin America? And to be a little more specific, how have U.S. relations with Venezuela been impacted by these recent events?
So first on the question of relations with the broader region, things have been surprisingly very strong in terms of the number of Latin American countries that have expressed their support for some of the strikes and U.S. naval presence in the region particularly. Trinidad and Tobago is the country that comes first to mind and most to mind when thinking about a Caribbean country that has been very expressive in its support for the United States deployment. Jamaica has been the same. Guyana has been the same. The Dominican Republic has been the same. And then in South America, you've had countries like Peru, Ecuador, Paraguay, Argentina, all of them expressing support for the United States and its new pattern or paradigm of dealing with counter-narcotics. Now, those countries have gone even further. Some of them have gone even further, the Dominican Republic, Ecuador, Peru, Paraguay, and Argentina, and synchronized some of their policies with the United States. So all five of those countries I just named have also declared some of the same cartels to be foreign terrorist organizations as the United States. From Washington's perspective, that looks like countries in the region are synchronizing with us. or harmonizing their approach with us. And notably, those countries that have been critical of the United States military deployment, they've been critical in a way that's rather muted, right? Mexico has kept its criticism at pretty low volume. The only country that has been very overt in its criticism of the United States has been Colombia, led by President Gustavo Petro, who was recently sanctioned after he referred to strikes on vessels as murder. The United States sanctioned him, his family, and a close member of his presidential cabinet. So I think most of the region understands that this is a very important issue for the United States, and they don't seem to be necessarily looking to fight or criticize the United States on its new approach to counter narcotics. And moreover, I would argue some of these countries have been so impacted on the security front by drug trafficking that they understand that there is a need for a new approach to counter narcotics. And so some of them have even synchronized some of their laws and foreign terrorist organization designations with the United States in recent months. On the Venezuela bit of this, the force posture currently in the region is so large, one of the largest since the late 1980s when we saw Operation Just Cause, which was the operation that overthrew the dictator of Panama, Manuel Noriega, or Operation Uphold Democracy in 1994 under the UN mandate when we were involved in Haiti, reinstalling the Aristide government there. Since then, the United States hasn't presided over a deployment that is this large. And so because the deployment is so large, about 10% of the U.S. Navy's currently deployed vessels are in the SOUTHCOM area of responsibility. Many have started to speculate that this deployment could go beyond a simple counter-narcotics operation. And the rhetoric, Joanne, has been very focused on Maduro himself and on the role of the Venezuelan regime in narco-trafficking, right? And the nexus between the state and its institutions and the Venezuelan armed forces and Maduro himself and some of these activities. And so there's a great deal of speculation right now as to what the deployment could provide in terms of options to President Trump when it comes to regime collapse, regime change, negotiating some kind of exit for Maduro.
Yes. Now, as you mentioned earlier, a major justification for the strikes has been the counter-narcotic efforts. And so, in your opinion, how effective will the U.S. campaign be in disrupting drug trafficking flows?
I think, Joanne, we need to look at this in terms of short, medium, and long term. Short term, the drug trafficking organizations, cartels in the region, are likely looking at these strikes and finding them to be deterrents, because right now, in my opinion, it's pretty close to the definition of insanity to want to get in a fast boat right now in the Southern Caribbean or even in the Pacific theater and to try to head quickly towards the United States with drugs on board. It's just not a good idea, given all the videos, now 17 of them, as I mentioned, that have come out showing this new paradigm. So I do believe in the short term, these videos are likely circulating on Signal, on WhatsApp, on other groups other chat groups where these organizations tend to plan their operations, and is likely having a deterrent or highly dissuasive impact. Now, we know that foreign terrorist organizations or drug trafficking organizations are highly adaptable, right? They adjust and are oftentimes one or sometimes multiple steps ahead of governments. So what we should expect in the future is that vessels, which would normally be in the maritime domain, might become drugs that are coming via small aircraft to Central America, where radars and control of airspace are not always the best, or to small island states in the Caribbean as they hop their way closer to the United States. These are the types of strategies that sometimes drug trafficking organizations could use to kind of get around the current U.S. paradigm. And in order to be successful, I would argue, in the long run, the U.S. is also going to have to be flexible and adaptable in moving its strategy to counter however the criminal organizations happen to pivot.
Yes, and to evaluate that kind of effectiveness, what metrics would you use to analyze the effectiveness of the U.S. campaign?
Well, Joanne, with any counter-narcotics campaign, as the president has said, it is, at the end of the day, about saving lives. And the United States, unfortunately, has many, many people who have suffered the ultimate consequence and perished from drug overdoses in the last decade. And so I would say that the ultimate metric has to be lives saved, right? We have to continue driving a reduction in death from overdoses in the United States. And that's not just cocaine, it's not just fentanyl, but it's a number of other drugs that are affecting U.S. communities. So that's the ultimate metric. And then there are other metrics that we can look at in terms of the amount of product seized in the maritime and the air domains. We could look at the street level value or the price of some of these drugs. Presumably, since it is a market like any other, if the price is going up, that there has been an effective set of seizures that is reducing the supply, and therefore price is going up to reflect a tightened supply. Vice versa, if price is going down, I think it's slightly indicative of the fact that markets could be flooded with product, which would of course indicate that a lot is entering the United States via maritime, air, or border routes. So those are just some of the metrics that we should use. But I think that there's at least one other that I would put out there for listeners, and that is this. I mentioned in my previous answer that in the short term, these strikes have likely had a deterrent impact because of the spectacular nature of them and the very lethal consequences to being out in a boat trafficking drugs in the Southern Caribbean and the Pacific right now. However, I think that it's far harder over the long term to shape the behavior of non-state actor groups or foreign terrorist organizations. It's far easier to shape the behavior of states. And so I would argue that the Trump administration's approach, having found some proponents in Latin America, is an important metric for how successful this paradigm could be over the long run, because it's easier to shape state behavior than it is to shape cartel behavior, for example. And so there are a lot of incentives that have been put on the table. There's a lot that's been said about partnerships we may seek to develop with certain countries in the region, and that is offering opportunities to shape state behavior to become closer partners of Washington on security issues. And that's much easier to do than to shape cartel behavior.
Yes, and I think this brings us to the broader diplomatic picture. What would you say, or how could these strikes damage the image of the United States in Latin America, given all of these unintended consequences?
Well, the United States certainly does not want to be seen as somehow curtailing legitimate commerce, affecting the livelihoods of fishing communities in important partner states. So I think that's an important aspect to consider here, and I think it can be mitigated if the administration releases a bit more information about some of the principles upon which these vessels have been selected for targeting. I also think that over time, we want to ensure that the strategy proves that it can be successful. Obviously, the strategy has involved a dramatic shift in how the United States does this. Usually, you would have counter-narcotics interdictions conducted by the U.S. Coast Guard, where if vessels don't stop upon being asked to do so, they might have their motor shot out, and then they might be boarded by a U.S. Coast Guard vessel and checked for drugs. Now the paradigm is simply that if we've done the intel work to know that you're part of a trafficking organization, we can see from aerial surveillance footage that drugs are on board. We shoot, and that is just such a different paradigm that I think it does have to show success in order to be able to get further buy-in among our Latin American partners. If it doesn't prove to be successful in that medium to long-term space that I mentioned, I think you could start to see Latin American countries saying things like, maybe we should try some of the old strategy, or maybe we should go a new direction that doesn't involve the same paradigm, but can have greater effects, deterrent effects on cartels and the incentives for trafficking.
Finally, for my last question, in your opinion, what measures should the U.S. implement to effectively address the issue of drug trafficking in general?
Well, Joanne, I think this is an issue that has been notoriously difficult for us to be able to talk about. I think a lot of folks talk about war on drugs or counter narcotics efforts as if it's a losing cause and we should just give up and legalize. But I think there's a lot of nuance that's been lost over the years, Joanne. And I think what we should be aiming for is management of this challenge, not complete control. It's when we start arguing about strategies that can get us to a point of complete control that individuals who are otherwise inclined to give up on this fight will be able to say, well, you're just never going to be able to control the flow of drugs into the United States, so we might as well legalize. That was actually never the goal of the counter narcotics movement. It was never to completely stamp out drug trafficking, just like counter crime strategies goals, if they're realistic, are never to completely stamp out crime, right? You're always going to live with some level of crime, but the goal should be to drive that down to the lowest possible levels. And so this is really about control and effective management of the flow of some of these dangerous narcotics. Now, there's the supply issue, but then also there's the demand issue. And at this point in time, as I mentioned, we're about a decade or more into the current crisis of overdose deaths. There are a few Americans at this point in time who are not affected in some way by this crisis. And so I think we all need to do a better part domestically as well to try to reduce deaths, not just on the supply side, but also on the demand side as well. Programs for people on the addiction side of things, ways of being able to save lives on the domestic policy front that can complement some of the work that's being done on the international front to keep dangerous substances out of our country. Those two things have to work in parallel in order for this overall comprehensive strategy to be successful.
Yes, thank you so much for sharing your insights and joining with me today, Dr. Berg. This has been incredibly helpful in understanding both the strategic intentions and the broader implications of the U.S. response. To our listeners, thank you for tuning in to 37th in the World, and if you enjoyed this conversation, follow or subscribe to stay updated on future episodes. I'm Joanne Chen, and we'll see you next time.
This was 37th in the World, the official podcast of the Georgetown Journal of International Affairs. Please be sure to subscribe and leave a comment and rating on whichever streaming platform you use. To support the podcast, you can click the link in this podcast's description that says support the show. To read other insightful interviews and articles, please check out gajia.georgetown.edu.